Hi, welcome to the screencast for Chapter 15, Section 1, Immigration. I've decided, in the interest of time, to use the PowerPoint that was provided by the textbook publisher, and I think this will make both my life and your life a little bit easier. I wanted you to see that the main idea for Section 1 about immigration is that after the Civil War, millions of immigrants from Europe and Asia settled in the United States. Key terms and names from this section you see listed there.
In 1894, the day the steamer tickets arrived for the Hay family, Hannah Hay became an instant celebrity in her small village in Russian-occupied Poland. Hannah's husband had left for the United States 3 years earlier to prepare a new home for the Hay family in Boston. Now that Hannah had received the tickets, she and her 4 children would finally be able to join him. A stream of curious visitors began to pour into the house. Hannah's daughter Mary, then 13 years old, described the crowd. They wanted to handle the ticket, and Mother must read them what is written on it. Were we not all going to have new dresses to travel in? Was it sure that we could get kosher food on the ship? And with the questions poured in suggestions, Mother mustn't carry her money in a pocketbook. She must sew it into the lining of her jacket. Before the family left, they gave away almost all their belongings and spent their last night at an uncle's home. I did not really sleep, recalled Mary. Excitement kept me awake, and my aunt snored hideously. In the morning, I was going away from Polotsk forever and ever. I was going on a wonderful journey. I was going to America. How could I sleep?
Okay, so that was the story of a young immigrant woman who came to the United States, and they came to the United States for various reasons. It's going to be the focus of one of our charts that we have in class later on. Now, in this time period, as we mentioned in the last chapter, there are millions of immigrants coming to the United States, and as you will discover in your crash course video by John Green, that there were a variety of different reasons why Europeans came to the United States, but it was also a global phenomenon. It was occurring across the world. People were moving to different areas of the world for different reasons. Now, one of the unique things about immigration in this time period in the 1890s is that the type of immigrant is changing. By the 1890s, Eastern and Southern Europeans made up more than half of all immigrants. Earlier immigration periods prior to the Civil War usually were made up of Northern and Western Europeans, and those are more like the ancestors who settled what became the United States. Also notice that of the 14 million immigrants who arrived during this time period, many of them were European Jews. I do not know if you caught in the anecdote provided by the young lady earlier, but one of the questions they had was, would there be kosher food available? And if you know anything about the Jewish religion, that you know that would identify them as Jews if they were asking about kosher foods. Now, why did people come to the United States? Here we see it. Jobs. America offered employment. There were a few immigration restrictions, but we're going to talk about how that's going to change a little bit. Avoidance of military service. In some countries and in some cultures, young men are required to serve a set amount of years in the military before they are allowed to move on to other facets of their life. It's required by law, and if they do not serve it, then they will be locked up. There's religious freedom. Particularly, the Jews were being persecuted in different areas across Europe, particularly in Russia. And then there's a chance to move up the social ladder, because in the United States there were not any hard and fast social classes. How did they get here? Most of them took the difficult trip in the steerage department. If you've ever seen the movie Titanic, then you know that story is about a wealthy young woman who falls in love with a man who literally has nothing. And if you contrast their lodging on the ship, she lived in very lavish, her passage was in a very lavish cabin, while he was in the bottom of the ship, literally just in what we would consider to be cargo. But steerage was the least expensive accommodations on a steamship. Took about 14 days, wound up at Ellis Island, and Ellis Island was located there where the Statue of Liberty is, and it basically was an embarkation area where immigrants were processed to come into the United States. This new processing center began after 1892. Most immigrants passed through Ellis Island in a day. They would have medical examinations. They would have to answer all sorts of questions. And if you were found to have some kind of contagious disease or not judged as being worthy to be in the United States, they'd send you back. Now, most immigrants, when they got here, tended to settle in cities. They lived in neighborhoods that were separated into ethnic groups. That's why we have Little Italy, Little China, and all these different areas in most major cities. And it is here that they were able to really interact with people who were more like them. So they duplicated much of the culture that they had left behind. Immigrants who learned English, adapted to American culture, and had marketable skills did better. It makes sense. Anybody who has marketable skills and money is going to do better. Typically, if they settled among members of their own ethnic group, they adjusted well in the United States. Because usually it's going to be that family members and people of your culture are going to help you be more successful. They're going to help you find a job. They're going to help you get on your feet. So, my question to you is, what helped immigrants adjust to living in the United States? Take a moment, pause the video, go back and review that. Make sure that you can answer that question. If you went back and you paused, then you see what the answer is here. The stuff I just read to you a moment ago. Now, Asians are going to have a different lot in the United States. They are leaving China because of severe unemployment, poverty, and famine. They are attracted to the United States because of the discovery of gold in California. Again, another motivator, another push out of China is going to be the Taiping Rebellion and persecution there. And another attraction is going to be the demand for railroad workers in the United States. Many of the railroad agents actively went out and recruited Chinese workers to work on the railroad. Of course, they would work for lower wages. You see evidence of this Chinese immigration mostly in western cities, although they did immigrate to different areas across the country. They typically worked as laborers, servants, skilled tradesmen, and merchants, and some opened their own laundries, hence the stereotype about Chinese people in laundries. Between 1900 and 1919, you also see an increase in Japanese immigration, and it drastically increased as Japan embarked upon this industrial economy and empire, basically modeled after what they had seen the United States do. And immigrants coming in on the West Coast, typically those of Asian descent, are going to go through a processing center named Angel Island, and that was after 1910. However, the circumstances are going to be quite different. In Ellis Island, you could typically be processed in a day. At Angel Island, many of these Asian immigrants, and most of them young men and boys, were housed for months in these barracks waiting for the results of immigration hearings. Many Asians face discrimination in the United States as a result of competition for jobs, or also as a result of the belief that whites were superior to others. So, what caused the increase in Japanese immigrants between 1900 and 1910? Again, pause here, review the previous slide, make sure you're able to answer the question. So, nativism. We see this term again. This came up in the last chapter. Nativism is an extreme dislike for foreigners by native-born people. You could also describe it as hostility towards immigrants. You can also define it as a preference for those born in the native country. Okay, it also expresses a desire to limit immigration. In the 1840s and 1850s, the United States had seen this nativism as people began calling for restrictions on the Irish. They had come here because of a potato famine in Ireland, and so they were coming here to escape starvation and economic ruin in Ireland. In the early 1900s, as I mentioned earlier, we see increases in groups of people that are not necessarily like our ancestors. And by that, I mean that they practice different types of religion. They practice types of religions that typically Protestants were suspicious of. They came from countries where they had different types of government and strange cultures. And people had this fear that these groups were going to bring these ideas to the United States and bring about the demise of the United States. And typically it's going to be Asian, Jews, and Eastern Europeans that are going to fuel this resurgence of nativism. And so you see evidence of this in the forming of two anti-immigrant groups. One is the American Protective Association, grew to about 500,000 members by 1887. The ironic thing about this is that the party's founder, Henry Bowers, was a descendant of people who had immigrated to the United States. He wanted to stop immigration, disliked Catholics and foreigners. Dennis Kearney, an Irish immigrant, there's that irony again, organized the Workmen's Party of California, and they wanted to stop Chinese immigration. Most of the time when you have this take place, racial violence resulted. Let me pause here for a moment and let you make the association. I want you to close your eyes and think for a moment about the immigration conflicts we have in our own country today and how it spurs a lot of the hatred and racism towards other ethnic groups in our own country and in our own state and in our own city. In 1882, the hostility towards the Chinese specifically led to the Chinese Exclusion Act. This nativism had grown to such proportions that people had appealed to Congress to limit immigration, and we see the result being the Chinese Exclusion Act. It barred Chinese immigration for 10 years, prevented the Chinese already in America from becoming citizens, and it was renewed in 1892, made permanent in 1902, and not repealed until 1943. So it had very long-lasting results. Why did nativists oppose Eastern European immigrants? Go back a few slides, review that information, and answer the question. Okay, so we've reached the end of section 1. Please make sure that you've reviewed those questions. Please make sure that you've taken the notes. Have a few questions for you here at the end, and I may or may not ask for these a little bit later, so make sure that you're familiar with them. Okay, cramped quarters on a ship's lower decks for the passengers paying the lowest fares. It's going to be steerage, and which means hostility towards immigrants is going to be nativism. Describe where most immigrants to the United States settled in the late 1800s. They settled in neighborhoods of large cities, usually within their own ethnic group. Explain why nativist organizations opposed foreign immigrants. Nativist organizations disliked their religion, and immigrants were perceived to take jobs from Americans. Remember, I also talked about how they were just not like our ancestors that settled the United States, or like those who had come before. Okay, and this last question is about geography and history. What routes did European and Asian immigrants take to get to the United States? Remember, I told you they had 2 different processing centers, so think about where they're coming from and how did they get into the United States. Europeans generally entered through Ellis Island in New York. Asians typically came through Angel Island in San Francisco. Okay, well this brings us to the end of this section. Make sure that you've taken notes and put those in your notebook, and don't forget to click turn in when you finish viewing the video. Thank you. Good night.